earning a black belt kind of in a sense means to arrive at a certain destination, which when you get there, it requires you to have a deeper reflection. And it's also a new beginning. If I think about the color belt stages, I often reference it as being in the womb, whereas being a black belt is like being born. It's like a new beginning. So although you're in development, you become a martial artist at a point where it's a new beginning as a black belt. And that's just the beginning again to kind of set foot. But there's always more to learn.
My guest for this episode is Dr. Danladi Whitten, also known to students at Macedon. Macedon began his martial arts journey at the age of 7 and has spent more than 4 decades training across multiple systems: Taekwondo, Taekwondo, Hapkido, and Japanese Jiu-Jitsu. He's the head instructor of JTR Jujutsu International in Washington, D.C., where he continued the legacy of his teacher, Grandmaster Don Jin Kim. Outside the dojo, Dr. Don is a doctor of physical therapy with more than 25 years of experience in private practice. That unique combination gives him a powerful perspective on martial arts, injury, recovery, body mechanics, and training for longevity. In this episode, we talk about his early martial art journey, the lesson he learned from Grandmaster Kim, and what it meant to carry the school forward after his teacher's passing, and how martial artists can train hard while still respecting the body enough to train for life. Let's get started. Hello, Master Don. Welcome to the Shugyo Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Love to talk to you about your martial arts journey. You started really early at the age of 7. Can you kind of walk us through a brief journey from martial arts?
Yeah, well, when I turned 7 years old, my mom decided to enroll me in a Tang Sudo program for a birthday gift. And in 1982, martial arts was really exciting and popular, not only in movies, but just in culture. There was a complete kind of immersion into martial arts, fighting, and many movies, that people would watch.
And you also have learned a lot of different martial arts throughout the year. What makes you branch out to other martial arts, and when does it become something that you really enjoy doing?
I think that the discovery of martial arts as a whole diverse ecosystem, pointing back to certain principles related to combat, self-defense. Initially, many, including myself, martial artists may have style bias, like, oh, my style is the best, or
Yes.
proclaim that they've found the key to success through their particular style. But the more you can explore different martial arts, the more it's an invitation to learning. And I think martial arts as a whole is really an opportunity to dig into oneself and to challenge oneself through the different stages of development. And when I think back to, you said about your childhood, I think about how early on that the goal essentially was to get a black belt.
Mm-hmm.
That's a tangible, easily accessible thing to understand. But earning a black belt kind of in a sense means to arrive at a certain destination, which when you get there, it requires you to have a deeper reflection. And it's also a new beginning. If I think about the color belt stages, I often reference it as being in the womb, Whereas being a black belt is like being born. It's like a new beginning. So although you're in development, you become a martial artist at a point where it's a new beginning as a black belt. And that's just the beginning again to kind of set foot. But there's always more to learn.
Do you think it's the mindset that you always want more information, to bring you branch out to different martial arts? Because I think you're in the camp that things is all about the practitioner itself. It's not really about the style itself. But at the same time, I will talk to purists, right? They will only stand by one style for life, right? They are the best style. That's why we're in. Is that how you see it? You just wanted to learn and keep on improving your skills and mindset and things that you like to work on?
Yes, and I don't think that it was so intentional. Like for example, my early styles were more related to striking, Tang Sudo, Taekwondo. In essence, those those styles definitely help shape part of my character and discipline, etiquette, being as though those were traditional and also sport style martial arts. But it was also location because, like, I left my home to go to college on the East Coast, and Tang Sudo and Taekwondo are you know, similar but different. In terms of the approach and the tournament style. Taekwondo being more related to kicks, especially the Olympic sport style. Tang Sudo, the sparring style has maybe 50-50 punches and kicks, relatively speaking. So, um, learning from new teachers wasn't like I was seeking it. Like, for example, I just would meet an instructor and then I would learn right there, like, hey, I'm not familiar with your style, but,
Mhm.
we have martial arts in common and tell me more, but there was also curiosity. But I do know that there's often great bias towards other martial arts. And also, in some cases, instructors too, teachers want to keep their students. And so it's like they'll do what they can, whether it's for personal or for business practice, to say, oh, don't go over there and train, stay in my school, pay your school
Yeah.
fees.
Can you recall the first time, your first encounter with Grandmaster Kim?
That was, it was kind of like the saying goes, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And one day in 2004, I was at my work in the fitness center and somebody said, hey, there's a martial arts teacher here to see you. And I said, huh? What? And I looked, and the other side of the gym was this short, stocky Korean guy. And he kind of saw me from across the way and he came over and said, oh, well, are you a martial artist? And I said, yeah. He said, okay, I'm a real master. And I said, whoa, whoa. Like, are we about to spar right here or what?
And then how long have you been training when the time that you met him for the first time?
Probably well over 20 years at that point.
Wow. Okay.
So I felt confident in my, abilities, but it was still, in Taekwondo and Tang Sudo. And so he introduced me to Hapkido and Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, which was, quite frankly, very different than what I was familiar with. More close quarters and joint locks, chokes, different weapons, throws. And so it was fascinating to be a student again, but also to be his assistant because he was a phenomenal instructor.
And how would you describe the teaching methods for Grandmaster Kim? Like, is he more hands-on or is he more, technique-wise? How would you explain that training experience with him?
Um, so his background was both military, kind of law enforcement. His kind of focus was government, which was why he moved to the Washington, D.C. area.
Mm.
And so he had a very kind of structured, strict style of teaching. you know, no nonsense, there was no play. It was, kind of follow orders. And he was not the most friendly guy when he was teaching. He had an attention to detail and a skill level that, you could recognize immediately. Um, he did things with speed, power, and precision flawlessly almost every time, which, that comes from really real dedication and also talent.
When you see Grandmaster Kim for the first time, and he worked with the military, he worked with law enforcement. So I would say those be no nonsense, right? Yeah, real technique to maybe overcome a person, right? To submit them. Uh, what are the techniques of difference when you first train with him? Or do you think he cut down all the unnecessary one to get to what needs to be done in a real situation?
Yes, I think that, when you get to more combat style martial arts, he used to say, my fighting style is dirty. And, there was a little chuckle humor in it, but the more I kind of studied it, it made sense. And I could also relate it to um, being in real street fights in my life where, there's no space, people don't give you room to reset, it's a bit unorthodox and ungoverned. And having trained for many years, there's a different level of intensity when
Mm.
somebody's coming for you for real. Whereas in most sparring in a dojo in a school, there's a degree of uh, you know engagement where I'm not trying to hurt you.
You're pulling the punches. You're pulling
Yeah,
the
they're
attacks.
throwing the
Yeah.
punches. There's civility. There's respect. But combat style, Master Kim would say, my favorite technique of ball technique, kick them in the balls. But he loved headbutt, groin kicks, elbows, knees. Uh, so those are quite effective, for self defense.
Mm.
They're
It's
hard.
re-
They're hard to demonstrate in, like free sparring. Like you have to really hold back as opposed to full application. So there's different tiers or levels of intensity. I think in most civilian practice, injury is paramount. Injury safety is paramount, and so there's governance around more governance around force. Both law enforcement and military, they trained at a much more high level intensity because of the real environments in which they practice and work. And so, we could use those training shields, pads, and that way you can deliver like full force or dummies. Um, Whereas going through the actual techniques, movements, those were more like muscle memory.
Mhm.
Application, you need to hit something really hard over and over again to develop the power behind the movement. So there usually would be the two forms. One is the technique, two is the application on drills.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It's really interesting to see. And how long did it take you to train with Grandmaster Kim for you to realize, wow, this is something that different, and then you decided to learn from him?
First year or so, it felt like private lessons because he would come to my job, and there were a couple people that we would have classes with. But he started to invite me to some of his other programs, and that's when I could really also appreciate his popularity. Working with say the airport police or the military that were in proximity here in Washington D.C. So D.C. is pretty relatively small as a city, so you can get around. And he got around. He would find locations where he wanted to teach, kind of, connect and engage with people, and they would invite him to teach programs there, and people would follow. And so you could easily see how devastating it would be if you were to be hit with some of the techniques. Or the other thing is just, the sheer force of, like an arm bar or an elbow lever, doing some of the kind of locks. Those things were painful immediately. So pain is the one language that everybody understands.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you can apply something with ferocious speed, power, technique, and yet not injure somebody, that is something that is admirable.
Grandmaster Kim passed away in 2015. Can you talk about that, and then why did you decided to take over JTR Jujutsu International?
Yeah, I mean, the loss, it was personal before it was like organizational. He was an amazing teacher, mentor, and even like a father figure for many of us as students. And grief is really heavy when you lose somebody abruptly, because he died the day after his 58th birthday. So there weren't like really signs. He had a massive heart attack in the dojo one morning before classes started. And so it was abrupt. There were no signs. Heart disease is a silent killer. But due to that sudden passing, I thought to myself, what would Grandmaster want us to do from here? We can't just like pack up our bags and leave. He's built and we've built something really special. And so the responsibility was really bigger than just one person. We needed to kind of come together and represent that legacy. And so, the goal wasn't to replace him, because nobody could do that. The goal was really at that point to preserve and continue what he built. I did step into that leadership position. It wasn't necessarily the smoothest transition, because I wasn't him. And, trying to be now almost the leader, authority figure, there were a lot of moving parts and different visions of how that would go. But I was the most senior student and had business experience. So it seemed a lot easier and more tangible for me to, to do.
You mentioned that he's almost like a father figure and a very special teacher to all his students. And, it's just, I don't think there's word can describe the feelings, right, when you learn about his passing.
It's an enormous gap in what is otherwise the normal business as usual. There was a deep absence felt, and loss. And people, they grieve differently. It was very personal in terms of loss, and just trying to find the right direction moving forward.
And at what point everyone start to come together and then honor the skills that he has, and then to kind of move on and then expand his vision?
Yeah, well, there were, at the time of his passing, there were essentially three master students who had been training under him for a decade. I was the most senior of those three. And so we collectively came together and broke up the schedule. So the school would be open 6 days a week, and we would all take 2 days to teach and preserve the classes. And so there were people that fell off immediately, that really didn't feel or, connected to the school anymore. Whereas there's always, kind of an exchange of people. So the new people came, and people would then transition out. And, to this day, I think there's still a group of us, kind of core students, who knew Master Kim and are part of that legacy.
I think it took you a lot of courage, right? And then extreme leadership to really step up to take over that role. It's not easy, as you say, there's only one grandmaster. What was your vision at that point? Or is it just to try to preserve the teachings of Grandmaster Kim? Or what else were you thinking in your mind at that time?
Well, you know, I saw it as a moment to step up for our school, for our community, for Sensei. Leadership is often romanticized, but real leadership is very difficult.
Yeah.
It's an immense burden. What happens behind the scenes is heavy. It's emotionally heavy. It's time consuming. It's trying to find the right balance. My vision was to move forward and to honor Master Kim through continuing the mission, similar to being in a war for the mission must go on. We can't surrender just because we've lost our dear leader. So for me, it was about finding the balance for respect for the tradition, whereas also there was need for growth, and it taught me an enormous amount of patience more than anything. So it became a culmination of my martial arts and business experience converging and into this one moment.
You created a documentary about his life called The East Dragon. Can you talk about that and what makes you decided to create this documentary?
Yeah, well, many great martial artists leave behind students, but you know, they never leave behind like a story. And so I felt like knowing him and knowing the importance that he served in my life and also in the eyes of others. He had a profound impact on us as students, but it's his reach seemed far. And I began to investigate that um, in pieces. So I knew him as an instructor, as a mentor and friend, but he was also, he had his own story to be told, like where he came from and how he evolved. And so I ended up traveling to first to Korea, to Seoul, and I met with his brother there, and I interviewed him, and he introduced me to one of his training partners who he trained with in Busan. And so I went to Busan and I kind of, started to backtrack his life in a way that I was like, okay, well, this is interesting. And I didn't know at the time that I had, the skills or anything to try to bring this together. But over the years, it almost took me 10 years to construct this story. And of course, there was many trials and tribulations, but I had a chance to travel to a number of different countries and interview people. I interviewed people from, the law enforcement that he taught in Utah. I went and interviewed one of his students in Sweden and another in Fiji. And so these collections of stories really came together to give me a better sense of who he was, and also the impact that he had. And so the project really became about preserving his legacy and, before the memories really disappeared. So I felt, compelled, like drawn, pulled to tell this story. It was a true master's test because it was really outside of my comfort zone. And but the people came into my life, onto my path, and supported it. And so that told me that the vision that I had was real.
Thanks for sharing. So it took you almost 10 years to compile all the interview, travel to different places to speak to partners, past students, and things like that. So it's been a journey on your part.
He had a constant principle to evolve, to seek something bigger than life in a way, and kind of adopting lofty goals. I think I inherited some of that, and so that compelled me to go and tell the story. And it was a bit of kind of like an investigation, because these clues, these signs, and these lessons, it was almost as if he was teaching from the other side. Because the things that I discovered, these qualities and sacrifices, they reinforced what I believed about his character, but it helped me develop a deeper relationship with that spiritual connection to Sensei and to a greater body. I call it the ancestors, which kind of speaks through him originally.
Mhm. Can you think of an example how you uncover something and then in turn it helped you to improve yourself as well?
Yeah, I think what surprised me most about, hearing from people in completely different chapters of his life was really the qualities and principles that he embodied. One was service. He was generous with his time towards his students. He was enormously, immensely, deeply disciplined. And, his commitment to stewarding and leading other students to become better, better characters. It showed me that who he was on the mat was who he was everywhere. And, I think when I reflect upon the sacrifices that he made, it made me ask myself, well, what is my purpose? And I began to align my life purpose with teaching martial arts. I didn't go to college for that directly, but when I think about what I can contribute to humanity and to my community and to the greater society, I think that I have something valuable to contribute through my experience and knowledge and person.
Thank you for sharing that. And can you talk about the scroll that you received for your lineage, for your style?
It's called a tiger scroll, and I believe the Japanese name is a Toronomaki. How's my Japanese? Um, it dates back to the time of the samurai, the feudal period, where you know nowadays belts and certificates are given, but this scroll really represented a preservation of martial arts um, through different symbols. It was really like a symbol of trust, something that, like almost like a baton of ownership in order to teach and preserve um, a lineage of martial arts. And it was often given in secrecy and very valuable, so much that, people would almost fight to the death if there were two students who were in the ranks to be inherit the style. But Master Kim's wife gave that to me after his death, which was an enormous honor, based on knowing its significance, its symbolism, and the history behind it. I really have felt honored as a result to be gifted something so valuable that was given to Master Kim from his sensei in Fukuoka, Japan, at the time that he became a grandmaster, his eighth dan in jujutsu.
What is normally written in the tiger scroll, or is that secret that you can't share?
They're kind of encrypted in a way
Mm.
that, the next person that gets it can't really learn the essence of the style. So it has more, it doesn't say, okay, kick twice or punch this. Doesn't doesn't directly speak to a technique, but it more so talks about principles of, the art itself, and how one can govern themselves on the spirit side. So yeah, it really, I had it I had it translated. There was some significant things in there that pointed in a way that you can shape your training and mindset.
Hmm.
It's a way that you can continue to refine yourself and reflect, because they're more open ended in a way,
Hmm.
and so you can revisit it at different stages in your growth process, and it may mean it may speak to you differently. Um, I don't want to get religious, but it really speaks to the spirit, and how the spirit is shaped in different phases in your life. It can speak to you differently. You can relate to people differently as a result of where you are in your station in life, which changes. It evolves.
Let's switch gears a little bit. Instead of Master Don, I'm going to call you Dr. Don right now. You have a doctorate degree of physical therapy, and then you also have practiced over 25 years in your private physical training practice. So, talking to Master Don, what are, as a martial artist who is lifelong doing the art, what do you see are the most common injury patterns among martial artists?
Yeah, well, injuries often reflect the demands that the art is practiced. And so I would say that striking arts, especially related to kicking, commonly can damage hips, knees, lower back issues. Grapplers and judo members can really damage fingers as a result of gripping, and wrists, shoulders are often damaged from the throws, as well as ribs. I would say also that many traditional martial artists often accumulate like chronic injuries from those overuse injuries, rather than, traumatic injuries from contact, but repetition. So many injuries are not caused like by a single event, but rather by like thousands of repetitions over many years doing certain things. And certainly age changes recovery capacity. So, even when your skills improve, the body keeps score. And so movement habits, and they can essentially be determinants of whether one gets injury.
Do you think it's just part of the journey? Because like what you just mentioned, right? Repetitive movement. In striking, obviously you have to do your punches and kicks so many times, right? In jiu-jitsu, you have to learn to take down, learn to feel the pain. So is it just part of the game, part of the journey, or it could be avoided?
Um, Rarely, I don't know that I met a real martial artist that has avoided injuries, but I do believe that it is part of the journey. Life has many kind of ruptures. Wisdom will tell you, the body will tell you when to hold back, when to make these adaptations, because even just let alone sitting in the chair right now, we could be doing damage to our lumbar spine or
Mm.
your neck, just based on your posture and position, because degenerative issues accumulate over time. Even sleeping can cause problems in the shoulders if you're a side sleeper, such as like rotator or shoulder degenerative impingement injuries. But injuries are going to happen. And so being smart about recovery is the other side of being a martial artist. Is you have to be willing to, with the yin, you have to find the yang. You have to find the right balance for your body.
Because I think in the martial art community, like no matter what art you practice, right, we learn to become more flexible. It seems like the way that the martial arts culture, they say the more flexible you are, the less injury. Is that the case? Like, what is your thought about that?
Well, stretching is an essential part of your training. I mean, if you're not doing a considerable comprehensive stretching, then you're inviting an injury because of how the body needs to, elongate for health. The other part is strength. I think there's a balance, is that often strength training gets overlooked in many cases. Flexibility, I want to kick high, or I want to move with this grace, whereas finding the right ability to have stability around joints, it creates a healthy environment for your body. I think it's fascinating is that martial artists are often incredibly tough people, but toughness sometimes causes them to ignore those warning signs
Hmm.
that would have them prevent even bigger problems, kind of let me push through it. So you have to give your body a chance to repair itself. And that speaks to the greater concept of health.
You mentioned strength too. And a lot of times when we do martial arts, the normal strength training that one can do is maybe do more push-ups, do more sit-up right before class,
Well,
or maybe you just punch the punching bag more. So when you say strength training, like in specific to martial artists, how would you balance that with your mobility and strength?
health is kind of like an ecosystem, right? I think strength and mobility are both in tandem. You can't have one without the other, or otherwise you're imbalanced in a way. So, there are a number of different free weight forms like calisthenics. I think squats are really great. When you kind of level up, you start jumping and doing more explosive movements. You have backups, which often get neglected because people do a lot of sit ups and push ups. The neck, kind of training neck muscles can often be really beneficial. Training the feet, by kind of doing more small joint kind of contractions. And those are in the absence of like weights, whereas using different forms of resistance, even doing something like a pull up, can be really essential for your body.
Yeah, that's really so so much to learn. And especially I want to ask you this question because in traditional martial arts, right, there are certain forms, right, that we have to perform. There's certain techniques that we're to perform. How would you see it in your way in physical therapy? Is someone having like shoulder ache or maybe they have a hip problem before, not able to use the textbook form or technique? Like, are you in the camp that they should just not do that technique, or you should modify the technique to work for that person so they could experience the skills?
I think that there's an adaptation, that can be essential. If you have an injury and you decide to train, you need to govern that in a way that you don't exacerbate the injury, which is often hard for many people since you get in the environment in the way that you move may encourage or stress healing tissues. So
Hmm.
part of it can be personality, whereas for more chronic injuries, that their injuries or won't resolve. Maybe there's torn ligament in the knee, or bulging disc in the neck or the back, or something that would require surgical repair or some. Then you may want to find a way to alter some of the activities that you're doing. It may mean that you might need to um, not do certain things, and step off the mat, or you may need to make a revision. I think that if you have an opportunity, though, it's better to engage at a lower intensity, because as the body as a whole system, that movement and activity can actually encourage healing. But it also depends on the art and the practitioner. So it's not a one shoe size fits all.
That's a really great answer. Do you think the mindset is sometimes setting martial artists back because they assume that, I could do it in my youth. So I'm 50 now, so I could still can do the same technique. Do you think it's the mindset that holding people back?
I think that longevity is a skill.
Hmm.
I think that given that the body changes, the mind should adapt. And one must change the way that we move sometimes in relationship to diagnosis or new events that occur in the body. So, one of the biggest mistakes that somebody mindset is that they want to train at 55 the same way they trained at 25.
Yes.
I think that that's a mistake. I think that, you need to approach it differently from the standpoint of learning, because the body teaches you, how to engage with it. It's an instrument. And for older martial artists, sometimes that requires more preparation, getting to the school earlier, doing a warm up, spending time doing those stretches, doing more strength training outside of the dojo, to ensure that these injuries are being either dealt with or, in the event, like you said, high kicking. You know, if you have, say, some arthritis in the hip, well, doing, a high side kick or spinning kick puts a lot of force into that hip joint, and that at your own risk, you're going to tear that cartilage more if you're feeling aches and pains, stiffness every morning. That's low grade inflammation. You might want to reach out to your ortho about that total hip replacement sooner than later. But in preservation, you start to appreciate that there's an injury there that is progressive, and therefore I need to make an appropriate change. And so that's where one learns humility through some of these events that happen in the body.
Yeah, that's really like never ending. It's so unique to everyone. I know that there are grandmaster in the 70s, they can still do a split, but I've been trying my whole life doing a split and can't do it. So it just depends on the person. Speaking of that, Masuda, you actually create a martial art program to help people with severe injury and using martial arts to help them better. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I had one of my students approach me one day and said, Master Don, I was in the Marine Corps. I've long retired. I have a family, and I've had 5 strokes. I'm disabled on one side of my body, as you can see. I'm severely disabled, and I'd love to do martial arts. And I said, oh, well. I thought about it. He said, I sought you out because you were a physical therapist. I found you online. I read about you, and can you teach me martial arts? I said, oh, well, of course I can. Let's go. Let's get this. And, you know, it was really an integration of both physical therapy and martial arts, because I had to use both clinical skills so that this guy would not get injured. As a result of training, I knew things that he could do or couldn't do, and the balance. And I also wanted to find a way to challenge the student. And we worked together for about a year. And at that time, he said, Master Don, I have a group of people at the National Rehab Hospital. And this group are severely disabled members of our community society. There's an adaptive fitness program for people with disabilities. Would you considering teaching there? I said, oh, well, let me think about that. Of course I can. Let's go. So I went there, and I found around 15 to 20 people of, both men and women, who were either wheelchair bound with cerebral palsy from birth, injuries of the brain, spinal cord injuries, strokes, amputees. And so there was a variety of different functional limitations, but there was the will to participate in a program of martial arts. And so I constructed techniques that they could do from seated position or modified standing using a chair for balance. And we would go through these different kind of technical movements and forms. And I found it to be the most amazing experience as an instructor because not only were they enthusiastic, disciplined in terms of getting there on time, um, they were really warm people who were putting their best effort. And so we came up with this modified way to teach people with disabilities the techniques based on where they were. And so for me, it was a test to create something that was unique for this group. And they're like family.
So you combine Master Don and Dr. Don together and to create. So is all the techniques unique to the person's ability?
I think so. I mean, if you don't have great motor control, or you have paralysis, or you have deformity, then I have to really look very closely to see form, right? So in one case, if your whole side is paralyzed, of course you can use that side, but let's use the able side to demonstrate that you have the knowledge of the movement, you know? You can do a kick from seated with the right leg, right? But the left leg, you may have to manually assist that with the free, with the strong arm, So there's the adaptive nature of doing those movements. I actually held them accountable. So we would have modified testings, and some students would pass and some students would fail. And so they got the sense that they were embedded and involved in the journey of martial arts, which is a deeper meaning for us all.
Can you give an example of how one trained in that program feel better, or is it more like a mindset that they see something that they could do now, so they're more into it and keep coming back?
Yeah, I think there's the physical part, and then there's the mental and emotional part for the participants, which they have conveyed to me. The physical part is that they're doing movements that are therapeutic. A lot of the physical therapy has kind of either low intensity movement, but I would ask them to do repetitious movement that was more explosive, more fast,
Hmm.
and it would recruit more muscle. So I think they got a good workout. People would say, "Oh man, I'm sore from that last workout, from that last training session," and they would actually get a chance to hit the pads. And when you hit something, even if you're seated, it hits you back because there's
Yeah.
the force applied is the force in response to that. And so that causes a reverberation and vibration in the muscle. And, for many of these people, the inactivity is a problem too. So it would strengthen them in a way, and it would give them better blood flow in a general sense. The emotional part was the release of frustration that many people with disabilities have. It was the sense of confidence of I can do something besides just be an invisible person in society. I'm earning my way, and so they would work hard. And then also community, because they would get together and I would kind of scold them for laughing or joking in class.
Mhm. I think this is an incredible program. And without your martial art experience, the physical therapy side can't do it all, but you kind of merge them and using all the experience, right? From your practice, from your martial arts practice, from your physical therapy practice. And you could, like, I think that's only you could probably do that. Like, a lot of people can't do it.
I think many people would be intimidated
Yeah.
because they sense or they feel that people with disabilities are fragile and can break easy on some level. As a physical therapist, we're designed to try to challenge and push people. And so that's the art of therapeutic, rehabilitative care, is that you have to adapt, modify, at times improvise, ways to challenge a patient meaning one who suffers, right? And we all suffer in some sense. Looking at them not as just as patients, but as students, there's a change in our relationship, right? I can have these kind of demands, let's go. As a therapist, you can't you can say, well, I can't use the same
Yeah.
tone of voice. Dr. Don and Master Don have a little different energy.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think you probably learn a lot from that too. My question is, from the ancestor who created jujitsu, how do you think that they created all those joint locks technique? Like they don't have X-rays, they don't have all the advanced technologies that we have to see the human body. Like, how do you think in the old days they developed those locks, or it's just they just create a victim and then they just bend and twist them to develop their own technique?
I would imagine the ancestors of the early generations were like many great minds and scientists. They would test, they would explore. And, I don't think that you need an anatomy book to know that the elbow is going to have a limitation. It's going to have a range, which it goes forward and back, and it reaches a point. And if you go beyond the point, you create some sort of discomfort. And so I think the principle that many can understand is there are circles, is that you're moving through a range, an arc of movement, and that you reach an endpoint. And to go beyond that endpoint is your body will tell you that there are limitations. And so everything from a finger lock to a wrist lock, elbow lock, shoulder lock, or even the neck, right? There are limitations on how far it goes in one direction before you experience pain. And so pain is usually the greatest teacher of all. So they must have been exploring the limitations and testing, quite a bit of testing on one another, and being as though many of these things were tested in real combat situations, they could see the effectiveness of it.
Hmm.
Um, just general observation as well. Maybe somebody fell in the village or something and came back with their elbow dislocated or something, and so that understanding that there are, terminal points.
Is it why you get more fascinated in jujitsu because of your medical training? And then in jujitsu, you say, I could heal that joint, but I know if I apply enough pressure, I could really damage the tissues and the nerves there.
Yeah, I think that the two converge in some sense. I mean, I can appreciate that training, right? There are sometimes injuries. And so there's a way that you should approach the healing process when you do get an injury. This, speaking to our martial artists, number one is about calming the area where it's injured. So using like ice, for example, causes the body to cool that area which is inflamed. That's why it produces heat. So giving it the kind of a balance. Often things will restrict in terms of movement, and that's where you want to move it. You want to increase the range. You want to normalize movement. So going through those natural movement patterns is the second stage of restoration. And the third is about strengthening, building, kind of fortifying, stabilizing an area. And I would say that last is about function. So applying it to different, more dynamic forces and stuff. But I do see the relationship, strong relationship between how physical therapy is applied and martial arts is applied. There are certain stretches we do. I say, I got to stretch this hip or this knee or something. Then I think of, okay, now I'm going to do a technique, I do in the dojo to get the best response. Tell me, tap when you feel it. You know what I mean?
So, Mastodon, for listener who want to reach out to you to learn more about your martial arts side and learn more about your physical therapy practice, what would be a good way to reach out to you?
They can find me on the website. I think there's a treasure trove of information at JTR Jujutsu.com. That's JTR JUJUTSU.com. And feel free to call me. I'd love to engage with members of the martial arts community. I'm always happy to also answer questions about injuries. We are a part of the greater family society of martial artists. And as a PT, I often do even free consults that it's service is honor. So
Thank you so much, Master Don. I'll include all the link in the show notes, and I'll also include the link to the documentary, The East Dragon. And thank you so much for being an open book. I know I asked you a bunch of questions, and you answered them perfectly.
oh, thank you for having me, and I appreciate the invitation to be on your show.
Thank you.
Okay.